is at the darkest hour and at the lowest point of the war. The forces of Nazism stand at the edge of victory. In the summer of 1940, in a tumultuous few months, the phony war had burst into a dramatic and terrifying real war. After a disastrous campaign in Norway, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, the architect of 1930s appeasement, the man who had sacrificed Czechoslovakia at Munich, had lost the faith of British people in Parliament and had dramatically fallen from power. He was replaced by Winston Churchill. Churchill famously came to power offering the British people nothing but blood, sweat, and tears. The spring and early summer of 1940 had brought the British people nothing but bad news. The British armed forces and their allies nothing but defeat after crushing defeat. The continent of Europe had fallen rapidly before the blitzkrieg of the Panzer armies. Holland, Belgium, and France had all surrendered in the space of weeks. The French were nationally humiliated as the Wehrmacht marched down the Champs-Élysées. With the entire British army in France nearly encircled, their backs to the sea, a mysterious moment of indecision by Hitler had saved 1/3 of a million British and French soldiers evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk by an armada of small boats and ships. In Britain, the country and the people awaited invasion by the Nazi armies. The south coast of England was turned into a fortified camp. The home guard of old men and boys was hastily recruited and stood waiting with desperately improvised weapons. The very structure and fabric of the country was broken up to fuel the war effort, to build planes, tanks, and ships. The population awaited the ringing of church bells, which would be the signal that the invasion had begun. Fear, rumor, and paranoia infested the British people as spies and infiltration were seen everywhere. Elsewhere, the world seemed to be turning its back on Britain and her empire. The Soviet Union had extinguished the independence of the Baltic states, content that Hitler had given the Soviet system a free rein in the East. Fascist Italy had joined the war. The Rome-Berlin axis was now a military as well as a political alliance. The United States remained steadfast and resolute in its neutrality. Churchill promised Britain's enemies that they would be fought on the beaches, that Britain would never surrender. In the high summer of 1940, the battle for the survival of Britain and of freedom in Europe was not being fought on the beaches, but in the clear blue skies of southern England. The story of the Battle of Britain is a story of weapons, a technological story as much as it is a story of collective national heroism and the individual courage of young men. In this, it is a retelling of an old tale. Since the very earliest days of warfare, of human conflict, the need to survive, the need to defend yourself against your enemy, has spurred the invention, innovation, and the creation of ever more destructive and more terrible weapons. And the weapon that hits harder, faster, or further has always been countered by either an even more powerful weapon or by a better defense, better armor, a better shield, better ways to hide. To understand the Battle of Britain, we must look back before the war, when military thinkers all over the world were theorizing about future conflicts. At the turn of the century, it can be hard to realize that the invention of powered flight is an event that exists still within living memory. That flight of Wilbur and Orville Wright was only in 1903. In the interwar years, aircraft were just one of a series of breathtaking inventions, miracles of science that had amazed the world. Their role in warfare during the conflict of World War I had grown. In 1914, the flying machines were consigned to reconnaissance, to acting as spotters and spies. By 1918, the war had pushed the technology forward, and specialized aircraft, war machines, bombers, and fighters had developed. The Great War had seen the first strategic bombings of civilian and industrial targets. ordinary people far from the front, where armies struggled, experienced the terror of aerial attack. By that war's end, the technology had advanced such that in 1919, a British strategic bomber was able to make the first crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. Military theorists seized at the airplane as a decisive weapon that could change the nature of warfare forever, as a way out of the horrors of trench warfare. Politicians saw the airplane as an awesome machine that could win wars cleanly, without casualties, in a matter of days. It was believed by politicians and soldiers in all countries that the bomber would always get through. Between the wars, it was widely believed that the next war would be fought with a short air battle, where one side's air force would be defeated, conceding air supremacy. Then, under threat of absolute destruction from bombers, victory would be conceded without any actual bombing of cities taking place. Perhaps warnings would be dropped into the centers of industry and populations would be evacuated in panic, and then denied to the enemy by the use of poison gas. Because the theory held, no sane government would risk devastation in this way. Wars in the future would be clean, short, with minimal deaths and destruction. Experience between the wars had seemed to prove that the bomber would always get through, and that air power would result in the predicted victory. Nazi bombers in support of Franco in the Spanish Civil War had wrought apocalyptic devastation upon Spanish Republican cities. The fate of the Basque city of Guernica was held up as a warning to the world of aerial power. The British Royal Air Force had ruthlessly used bombing to economically and painlessly, without British casualties, police the wilder parts of the British Empire, bombing the villages of rebellious tribes in Arabia and Afghanistan, sparing the cost and the risk of British ground troops. During the 1930s, the Italian Air Force had used aircraft and poison gas to subdue the forces of Emperor Haile Selassie in Ethiopia. Of course, these easy successes were an illusion. The Spanish Republican government had no air force, no air defense system that could deal with what were state-of-the-art German aircraft. Guernica was a soft, undefended target. The tribespeople that the Royal Air Force intimidated had no air defense, no shelters, and no fighters. The RAF even had the luxury of marking gigantic figures and directions on the surface to aid navigation. The Ethiopian society that Italy attacked was medieval in its structure and technology. Even so, the Second World War, up to the onset of the Battle of Britain, had seemed to prove that air power was irresistible. Soldiers from Poland to France, across the entire continent, had cowered, fled in panic, and died under remorseless attack by German aircraft in close support of advancing German armies. Again, this success was not a proof of the air power theories. The use of aircraft as close support to land forces is a long way removed from strategic air power used by one industrialized, advanced country to defeat another. The Blitzkrieg that had swept across Europe was a new way of making war, but it was a theory that combined tanks, planes, and infantry to defeat the enemy's army. In the Battle of Britain, for the first time, air power was on its own in an individual struggle, Air Force versus Air Force, unaffected by the needs of soldiers and sailors. History likes to assign dates to the start and end of events. Rarely are events seen at the time so clearly. The Battle of Britain began at the instant that the Battle of France ended. All through July of 1940, there were skirmishes between fighters, minor raids as the two air forces fenced, feeling for their enemies' weaknesses. Hitler named August 13th as Eagle Day, when the main assault was to begin. Hitler's Führer Directive 17 ordered the Luftwaffe to overpower the English Air Force with all the forces at its command in the shortest possible time to attack the flying units, ground installations and supply organizations and the aircraft industry. The objective of the German Air Force on Eagle Day was simple: to destroy the British Royal Air Force completely. Then the Luftwaffe would be able to attack at will, striking anywhere, anytime. It would have air supremacy. With air supremacy, the British Navy would be powerless to prevent the German Army's proposed river crossing of the English Channel. Operation Sea Lion, the invasion and conquest of the British Isles, would begin. All over northern France and the Low Countries, the Luftwaffe gathered all its strength. The ancient Chinese philosopher of war, Sun Tzu, held that every battle is won or lost before it is fought. That every factor determining the outcome of a conflict is already in place, in the men, in the weapons, in the geography, in the minds and the plans of the commanders. In that summer of 1940, as the two air forces prepared to fight, each had their strengths and weaknesses. The RAF was small, numbering little more than 600 fighters. The British bomber force was to be irrelevant in the battle. But the fighter planes were the twin legends of the war: the Spitfire and the Hurricane. The Hurricane was a devastating attacker of the German bombers, its armament and its design. Once again, the most carefully argued of peacetime theories as to how the next war would be won was put to the test of actual war, and the course of events was to confound the best thought-out plans. In the first phase of the Blitz, bombers came every night. Indiscriminate, vaguely aimed attacks were made on the docks on the East End. After the heavy losses of the Battle of Britain, the Blitz was a happy time for the Luftwaffe, with German losses of only 1% of sorties flown. The British defeat. It is legendary how the British people showed that bombing does not break the will to resist, and in many cases stiffened resolve. The British civilians climbed over the rubble to carry on their lives in defiance of Hitler. Looking back from a world where war and airstrikes are reported as breaking news, where the perception of a war is as important as the actual strikes, it is perhaps hard for us to see the Blitz as a media event, as news information, the same way as we see wars fought over 50 years later.
Thanks to the Anderson's shelter, we're quite safe. I think he dropped a couple of bombs on us and it shook the Anderson's shelter like very ill. But when I heard the four boys talk to me, I was quite contented.
The Blitz was the German attempt to make the British people reject the belligerent defiance of Churchill, to weary them of war, and prepared to accept peace on any terms. The Blitz was presented by the British in ways that outraged. Images of business as usual, of Prime Minister, of King and Queen with the victims of this terrorism were used to present the leadership as all in this together with the people. The pictures of ordinary innocent civilians made homeless, turned into refugees in their own country, was used in a drip feed of propaganda to turn US public opinion against the Nazis. The truth of the Blitz, as with all truth, is more complex than the fiction. In some places, civilians did flee the cities of Britain in panic. Some people did loot from bomb wreckage. Churchill was not always greeted with cheers. The British Communist Party tried to stir agitation, that workers were being allowed to die through lack of air raid shelters. We live in a world where politicians are too often led by public opinion polls. polls are not new. It's a simple fact that in secret Gallup polls taken by the British government throughout the Blitz, 80% of the population believed in ultimate British victory. With the Battle of Britain a failure, and his main enemies still defiant, though bloodied, what now was Hitler's plan? What now could be his strategy for victory? On October 12th, Hitler cancelled Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, and a new German strategy was unfolded. Rather than deliver a knockout blow, Hitler now chose to pound around at the edges to wear Britain out. Pressure on Britain would be increased by attacks on ever more fronts, stretching both Britain's resources and the will to continue. The incessant pressure of the Blitz would stretch the nerves. Diplomacy would be used to add to Britain's enemies, inducing more and more countries by either threat or the offer of the spoils of victory to come over to the Axis. In late October of 1940, Hitler met with two men he thought could be an aid to this plan. In Spanish dictator Francisco Franco, he sought an ally who would assist his strategy by seizing the British base at Gibraltar, and so closing the Mediterranean to British use, increasing the pressure on North Africa and Egypt. In return, Spain was offered the reward of France's North African colonies. Many historians call Franco a fascist. That he refused to be involved with the war and kept Spain neutral reveals a fascinating dimension to his character. Showing him not a revolutionary politician with a set of beliefs like Hitler, but rather a simple conservative, shrewd and ruthlessly realistic who thought only of his and his country's interests. Hitler was to say of his meeting with Franco, "I would rather have 3 or 4 teeth extracted than go through that again." Hitler met Vichy French leader Pétain and again offered the bribe of colonies. The French territory promised to Spain would be replaced with former British territories. In return, Vichy France had to enter the war on the German side. Pétain showed some of his old stubbornness and refused to become further involved. Already in mid-September, as part of this new strategy of encirclement and a widening of the war, Italy had attacked Britain in Egypt. Italian forces based in Libya, which was then an Italian colony, had invaded Egypt, which was a British protectorate, ruled as part of the British Empire. An ancient country, significant in world history millennia before, was once more a player on the center stage of world events. This was not part of Mussolini's usual posturing, a vainglorious move to make his fascist state look like a new Roman Empire. There was a clear, focused, strategic goal for this attack. The purpose was to cut off British supplies of oil from the Middle Eastern Arabian states, from Iraq and Iran, then all under British domination, if not direct rule. Without these supplies of oil, Britain would simply lose the war. The invasion of Egypt would cut the Suez Canal, an actual and symbolic link to Britain's worldwide empire. Over the next 2 years, the Western Desert was to become one of the most spectacular and dramatic theaters of war the world has ever seen. A place in which legendary leaders would emerge and where the names of individual units would mark their place in military history. It would be a war of dramatic movement over stupendous distances. The Western Desert was not to be some grim push, a grinding down of the enemy. It would be a conflict with astounding reversals of fortune, with both sides riding astride a seesaw of victory and defeat. The huge, open, featureless space of the desert and the absence of towns and civilians made for a war of easy movement, suited to the new mobile armored tank armies. It was to be a war fought with what would be seen as old-fashioned chivalry and respect for the opponent. Later, when Germany became drawn into the conflict, the absence of SS troops removed the worst excesses of brutality and reprisal that were to be found elsewhere. With hindsight, the Western Desert Campaign would be of major significance in the eventual outcome of the war, but the numbers involved were tiny compared to forces engaged elsewhere in the world. Italy's North African campaign of 1940 was the first time that Mussolini's forces had been pitched into a campaign of their own against another industrialized modern state, as opposed to terrorizing armies barely out of the 15th century, as in Ethiopia. The invasion of Egypt was the first where Italian generals had had to plan a campaign, rather than ride to victory on the backs of others, as they had when Italy belatedly joined the invasion of France. Mussolini's fascist state had proudly boasted that it had created a new, powerful, modern armed force, a military might that would rival and surpass that of ancient Rome. The history of World War II shows that these armies were not successors of the legions, and Mussolini was no Caesar Augustus. The truth was that although vastly expanded in number with splendid uniforms and no more or less brave than most soldiers of the time, Italy's troops were poorly equipped. What good modern weapons the country possessed were spread so thinly as to be useless. The body of men 230,000 strong that attacked Egypt was more of a 19th century force than a modern mobile armored army. The Italians slowly attacked, moved inside the Egyptian border, and after 3 days halted, waiting for more supplies to catch up. If the aim of Italy's Egyptian attack was in part to deny Britain oil, the Axis made moves of its own to ensure security of supply. In October, German forces moved into Romania, a move made to guarantee the Axis the only source of oil in the European mainland. This was not an invasion. Romania was a dictatorship and already sympathetic to the Nazis. In Europe, the war continued to spread to more and more European nations. As so often in the history of the European continent, the Balkans, that crazy patchwork of small countries with a multitude of confused minorities and minute ethnic differences, torn by ancient vendettas, hatreds, enmities, and grievances, was to play a part. A small Balkan conflict began, which was to be part of a far greater significance in the big picture of the history of the war. On October 28th, Italy invaded Greece, basing its attack from the neighboring territory of Albania, which Italy had occupied since April 1939. This was a war with little purpose other than the pride, vanity, and ego of Mussolini. To create a new Roman Empire, to avenge the loss of the tiny Ionian island of Corfu to Greece in 1923, and to show Hitler that Italy was not to be the junior party to the Axis. The invasion of Greece made little sense in terms of the bigger strategic picture. The invasion was to widen the war in a way that hindered Axis plans. Hitler looked toward a historical destiny of an eventual titanic struggle with Stalin's Soviet Communist Russia, a war he saw central to the future of civilization. Mussolini's sideshow would drag his German ally into a mire of troubles that would, in the end, help decide the outcome of the war. In the North Atlantic, the pressure from U-boat attacks was mounting to ever greater levels. There was a tremendous shortage of convoy escorts, of the small warships that could shepherd the groups of merchantmen across the ocean. The United States had a vast store of near-obsolete World War I destroyers known as the Four Stackers for their distinctive design. American President Roosevelt struck a ruthless deal with Churchill to receive the use of these spare ships as an instant enlargement to the Royal Navy. the British had to sign away control of their bases in the West Indies and Canada, giving them to the US. Roosevelt did not wish to appear to be violating US neutrality, and his hard-headed assessment was that Britain was likely to fall. The American president feared that a future Britain, now in the Nazi camp, would allow German warships and German U-boats to be based in the Caribbean. It was a deal of which the US obtained the best part. By the end of 1940, only 9 of the promised destroyers had arrived. Looking back on the events of 1940, we think of the year as part of the unfolding drama of World War II. Of course, to the people of 1940, it was not yet a world war. It was rather a European war. The transition to global conflict was yet to be made. With hindsight, again, the growth of the war to envelop the world was inevitable. But again, this did not seem the case in 1940. In September, while the Battle of Britain was reaching its height on the other side of the world, the Empire of Japan was marching on its path to war. Crucially, Japan took the decision to attach its destiny to that of Hitler, joining the Axis alliance. Why should Japan do this? What had Japan in common with Nazism, an ideology of racial superiority of white European peoples? Japan had felt threatened by the 1939 Nazi-Soviet alliance, a move which had taken Japan totally by surprise. The Soviet Union was a strategic threat to Japan's ambitions on mainland Asia, in China, and Manchuria. The driving forces of Japanese policy were the Army and Navy. By allying with the Nazis, Japan saw the Northern Soviet threat nullified. Japan saw an oncoming war with the United States as inevitable, and after the fall of France and Holland, believed the resources of the European colonies of Southeast Asia would be needed to fight a war against a strong industrial power. Across an ocean from the struggles of Europe, in the United States, a realization of the direction which history was flowing led America to introduce conscription in peacetime for the first time.
We have come to realize that the greatest attack that has ever been launched against freedom of the individual is nearer the Americas than ever before.
The Selective Service Act registered American men, and some were chosen for military service. The service of the draftees was restricted to the Western Hemisphere and U.S. territories, but the act was an important step to preparing the United States for inevitable conflict. The growing, expanding nature of the European war was the dominant issue of the 1940 presidential election in America. In a broadcast days before the election, Franklin Roosevelt promised the American people, "Your boys will not die in foreign wars." This promise helped Roosevelt win a record third term in office. FDR's place in American history as one of the greatest of peacetime presidents was already assured. His even greater place as a war leader was something that still awaited both him and America. Next time on World War II, The Complete History. The continuing disasters unfold around the Italian war effort, as the invasion of Greece turns to catastrophe for the Italians with defeat and rout into the hills of Albania. In North Africa, there are mass surrenders of Italian armies as the British Army of the Nile drives the Italians deeper and deeper to retreat. We shall see how the Italian failure draws the forces of Germany ever deeper to the south with the invasions of Yugoslavia and Greece. In North Africa, Italian defeat turns into German triumph as two legends emerge, and the names of Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps are linked together in history, and the tide of war sweeps the British to near defeat, only to rebound with dramatic counterattacks. Faced with German onslaught, British and Commonwealth forces face a second Dunkirk as they first invade and are then forced to flee from Greece in face of a ferocious German attack. Churchill demands that America give Britain the tools for victory. The ancient Mediterranean Sea, the site of so many a war, is once more the stage for epic naval action as the British Navy seeks to emulate its greatest victories, adding the battles of Taranto and Matapan to its roll of honor. In that wine-dark sea, the island of Crete is the scene for bloody and costly German victory, as the pride of the German armed might, the airborne and paratroop forces are squandered in capturing the island. Germany's losses in one battle more dead than the entire war to that point. In the Atlantic, the desperate struggle of the U-boat war continues, reaching a new peak. The British battleship Hood meets its nemesis in Bismarck. Bismarck itself was soon to sink. London still writhes under German aerial attack, with bombs falling on Parliament itself. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy and trusted aide, makes his mysterious flight to Britain, bringing a personal offer of peace. All these events are played out against the impending storm that is to break in the East, as Germany unleashes Operation Barbarossa, a war of annihilation against Soviet communism. Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia.